Mock-ups are overrated. Mock-ups are crucial.
Why? Why do you think that?
Oh, I can see that your seams don't line up.
If it doesn't fit, just add some gathering.
Not everyone deserves a handmade gift.
Don't force yourself to make what other people want you to make just because you have a skill that they haven't learned themselves.
Hello friends, and welcome back to a really fun video this week. I am going to be sitting down with Charlie from The Stitchery to discuss your sewing hot takes, because I had put out a survey on Instagram back in the fall asking for all of your sewing and costuming hot takes, and boy howdy, did you all deliver. I think this was the most responses I've ever had to an Instagram story, and let me just say, there were some spicy ones in there. So maybe go grab your current craft of choice, and this is a long video, so perhaps a nice beverage. Be sure to let me know what it is that you're working on in the comments as you listen, and settle in for some fun with a touch of snark. And also, if you are a monthly supporter over on Patreon or Ko-fi, be sure to go watch the version that I posted over there instead, because you have nearly 20 minutes of bonus footage of Charlie and I just chatting away, having fun with all your sewing hot takes. So with that out of the way, let's just jump right in, shall we? So I guess we should start off with the hot take that's going to kind of set the tone for the whole conversation, because I feel like it kind of sums up both of our opinions when it comes to sewing. And that is the person who wrote in that hot takes can quickly turn into just shaming differences. If it works for you, just do it. Which 100% yes. We love the term hot take. It's kind of like a fun game, but honestly, in the end, we're actually not here to judge anyone. We're just here to talk about sewing and all the different ways that one can sew, and how amazing it is that there's so much variety in the ways that we can sew.
Yeah, it's actually all about, for me, finding those other people who do it wrong. Like, usually, and I've noticed from these that like the bulk of the hot takes are people who feel like they don't do it the right way. And so their hot take is like, gasp, I'm not doing it right. And it's like, so many of us are not doing it right. This is all about finding those other people and realizing you are not alone in that, because there is no right way. There is just what works for you. And we can celebrate that while being a little bit snarky.
Yeah, don't even get me started on like institutional knowledge and sewing schools. And yeah, I could go on a whole rant about that, but I shan't, because instead I'm going to jump right in to the first real hot take, which is, well, there's two. They're like co-hot takes because they're completely on opposite ends of the spectrum. And it is, mock-ups are overrated and mock-ups are crucial. I mean, this is coming in pretty hot. We're gonna give it like 4 peppers on the spiciness meter. I personally am team mock-up. For me, it's all about, I know myself and the way that I sew and what I'm making and the level of fit that I want to achieve in a garment in order for me to wear it. And I'm not going to achieve that, usually. Depends on what I'm making, but usually I'm not going to achieve that if I don't do a mock-up. So I always do, but that's just because it kind of guarantees long-run success for me.
Yeah, it's funny because I think because I have such a distaste for making mock-ups, because I'm obviously on the other side of the spectrum so much that I found it funny that I didn't get a single hot take given to me about this, because I think everybody just already knows. Like, you don't do mock-ups, you don't have an opinion on that. But like, I think because I don't want to do the mock-ups, I kind of specifically make things that don't require me to make a mock-up, because there's so little precision to them, you know? It's like, just wing it, make it work, and like, if it doesn't fit, just add some gathering, or slap like a panel in there to make it bigger. Like, just do that, and it'll still be fine. But if I ever was going to try to do like something tailored and like well fitted, it's like, yeah, I probably would need to make a mock-up for that. But also, is that why I haven't done anything like that yet? Maybe.
I'm like, I like doing my mock-ups because it requires that like level of tweaking to get it right. And also because I enjoy it. Like, I kind of enjoy the fiddly things a little bit, but also, yeah, like, my attention span can handle doing multiple versions of a garment. Like, admittedly, sometimes I rush through the mock-up a little bit to like get to the fun shiny fabric and like the real deal. But I definitely think that there's something to be said about knowing yourself and the way that you sew. And do you have the attention span to make 2 of the same garment, or is it just gonna be like, I've lost interest in that, what's the next new thing, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting that you say attention span, because that is so true. I don't think I have the attention span for that. I don't like to make the same thing twice. If I am going to make something similar, like the dress that I've made like 13 versions of, each one still has to be pretty different for me to want to do that. And so I think for me, if I tried to make a mock-up and make it like, this is exactly what I want, and now I'm going to do the exact thing, and just with nicer fabric, I would end the mock-up and be like, I am now bored. I need to either tweak this in some way. I'd like take my mock-up and be like, okay, now we're doing the real thing. I'm going to change all of this stuff, and then it wouldn't be a mock-up anymore. But yeah, I think I know that for myself, I don't have that attention span to do it twice. I know that I'll lose interest afterward. And it is so important to know yourself, because ultimately, I think you should remove barriers between you and being creative. And if sewing is your form of creativity, which is a great one because you can make usable things, and creativity that turns into usable things is amazing. So like, if sewing is what you love to do, you have to look at it and be like, what are the barriers between me and the thing that I wanted to do, or the thing that I wanted to make, and can I remove that? And if making a mock-up is a barrier for you, if you have a bunch of mock-ups that you've made and you never ended up making the final garment, then stop making mock-ups. Stop doing it. It's not worth it to put that barrier between you and creation. If it's going to make you happier, if it's more likely to make you make a final thing, if it's going to please that little perfectionist in your brain, then absolutely do it. So yeah, the next little hot take that I have is all of the pattern ones, which I got a lot of these, and I think because people know that I have strong feelings about patterns. I liked the one that said, patterns are boring, drafting is half the fun, because I agree. But I think there was one that you got that I thought was especially spicy. It said, patterns are overrated, especially when they need to be modified so much anyway.
Yes.
Which, like, that is my beef with patterns. That's why I dislike them so strongly. And I know you use them a lot more. How often are you ending up having to modify a pattern for fit rather than design?
So I will start off by saying that I do think that my body conforms or comes a lot closer to like fashion norms that like the big four especially like to use. Okay, admittedly I have like way larger shoulders and like I'm much wider in here, but those adjustments are fairly straightforward. Whereas like I hear from a lot of my viewers that like they have to make so many changes. Like I've never had to do a full bust adjustment. My bust always pretty normally fits in with like what the fashion industry thinks should correlate with my shoulders and my, well, maybe not my waist because I don't have a waist, but generally speaking. So I feel like I always have to do some tweaks, but they're usually the same tweaks. They're the tweaks that I've kind of gotten used to doing, and they're pretty straightforward tweaks. I'm always like modifying a pattern so much to put my own creative spin on it anyway that it's like, well, what's one more modification?
Right? We're already in here anyway. But I mean, that is like, first of all, the big pattern companies are not size inclusive right now, which like, boo.
Yeah.
Be better. Like, you guys have the tools and the resources and the funding behind you. And then you have these small pattern companies that are, you know, not every single one is, but a bunch of these small pattern people that like, it's a single person developing patterns, they are massively size inclusive. And the amount of time and math and know-how that goes into that, like, is insane. That's a lot of work, and yet they're still putting that work in. So major boos to the big companies for not having that. But it's like, because of the lack of size inclusivity, because of the standardization of sizes, for me, it's like my waist is way higher than a normal person's waist. So even at like the smallest size on a pattern, my waist is still usually higher from like the back of the neck to the waist measurement than is on a pattern. And I kind of realized while we were talking about this that I think the reason I really like that princess seam dress, and the reason that it fits me properly, is because it is princess seam. And there is no waist. Because when I've made patterns that have a waist in them, typically the fit is not quite right at the end. Everything that I make is so high-waisted. But when I'm drafting it for myself, I can accommodate that. Just right from scratch, right from the beginning, I can make something that accommodates the fact that I have a really high waist. Rather than having to get a pattern and, have that acknowledgement kind of thrown in your face that like, you're not standard, get ready to modify things. It's like, why not just start from scratch and accommodate your exact size and shape? Because of course you're unique and of course you're different. And like, no, you're gonna have to do those modifications anyway.
I want to quickly interject here because I highly, highly recommend watching Emily Snee's video called I Beat an Eating Disorder, How Sewing My Old Clothes Helped Me, plus a history of why sizes stink. Now, obvious content warning because she does discuss eating disorders, but she also goes into great depth just discussing how and when standardized sizing became a thing. She breaks down just how absolutely ridiculous the entire concept of standardized sizing is.
It was deeply flawed.
Literally nobody fits into these size charts and never has.
Out of 4,063 men who already existed within a niche, literally 0 of them existed within a size range, literally created from their own measurements.
But she says it far more eloquently than me and with far more sources cited. So I will be sure to link that video in the description to this one for anyone else who is disillusioned with modern size charts.
I will say, yeah, I definitely, I like to use patterns a lot on the channel because I know that a lot of my viewers also like to use patterns. I feel like in general, a lot of people aren't comfortable either drafting something or completely winging it, and so they want to have that little bit of comfort that using a pattern brings, even if inevitably you'll have to make a lot of modifications to it. So I do it on the channel because I find it's kind of fun for the viewers to be like, oh well, if I like that, maybe I can also get that pattern as well.
I get that though, because then, on the other hand, I just get constantly asked to make patterns. And I'm like, no, I'm trying to teach you how to freehand. I'm trying to teach you how to wing it. And my thing is that I really think there is just this fear. And it's like, you guys, if you have fully modified a pattern to fit your body, then you very likely have more skills to self-draft something than you think you have.
Yeah, I wish more people would absolutely take the leap and just go for it because, I have a friend who is one of those small pattern companies and they make a lot of patterns themselves and a lot of size inclusive things and oh my gosh, I talked to them about all the headache and how complicated it is trying to figure out how to upscale patterns and it's wild. It's like a giant learning curve and the information is heavily gatekept and it's actually because there just isn't any good information about how to scale things up properly if we're going to be honest. But they were saying that for a couple of their patterns, they have some of the pieces that are just rectangles, like a placket for a blouse or a waist tie on a dress. They're just squares or rectangle. And some of their instructions tell you to just draft out and cut out a rectangle that is this big by this long. And they've gotten feedback that even that is pushing people's comfort levels of not having the physical piece of paper that they can print off and trace out. So if just doing that with a basic rectangle is already scary for some people, I definitely can see how trying to create a shape out of nothing can feel quite intimidating. But I do wish there was a way that people would feel more comfortable to just jump in and try it, which is, again, why I like mock-ups, because I always use the super cheap fabric, the bed sheets, and honestly, in my case, most of the time I have literally pulled them out of a dumpster. But in my case, it eliminates the fear a little bit of fabric waste. And to just jump right in and let's try this random shape and then see if it's anywhere near what it needs to be. But that's a level of comfort that I know my viewers definitely don't always have.
Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking, I would really love to try my hand at making my own clothing, but I just don't feel prepared for whatever reason. If you don't have the confidence to jump right in and draft your own clothing, or you would love to make some comfy knit dresses, but working with knit fabric terrifies you, then today's sponsor, Craftsy, might be just the answer. Craftsy is your online resource for all things creative, and they have tons of classes on sewing, including this 5-class set on how to master sewing knits so that you can make all of the comfy knit dresses that your heart desires. And if you're more into the fitted, tailored clothing, more like me, then you might enjoy ready-to-wear tailoring with Angela Wolf, which is another multi-class set. These instructional videos are taught by talented and friendly experts in their field. They'll walk you through each technique with step-by-step demonstrations, providing their expert tips and tricks and leaving you with all the skills that you'll need to start designing and sewing the wardrobe that you dream of. If you would like to join Craftsy and boost your sewing skills, the link is in the description, and the first 1,000 people to click it will get a full year of premium membership to Craftsy for only $1.49. So go give it a try, and thanks to Craftsy for sponsoring this portion of the video.
Then the next hot take is that we have, they're all kind of like revolving around this topic of homemade, and if there's like a certain stigma that feels like it comes with homemade garments. So one person's hot take was, why bother buying it if you can make it yourself, and higher quality at that? And I definitely, yeah, that's like a middle of the road spiciness level. Let's say it's like a 3 peppers for me, because I like see both sides of that, because on the one hand, yeah, I do like making my own stuff, because oftentimes store-bought is like, you know, produced on such a large industrial scale that it is kind of shoddy, or it equally doesn't fit you. Sometimes like if you want to feel good about your own stuff, go look at the inside of some of your favorite clothes, and you're going to see how sloppy the sewing and the construction is. It's not high quality sewing. At the same time, there's this meme that I saw, and if I can find it in post, I'm going to throw it up on the screen right now, but it was like, you know, basically making fun of this concept that everybody gets into it thinking that like, oh, I'm going to do it myself and it's going to be faster and cheaper. And then you're like, you know, hundreds of dollars of sewing notions later, you're like fully invested and so many hours down the drain, and you're frustrated and sweaty and cranky, and you still don't have a garment that fits. And I'm like, yeah, that's actually also the reality of sewing sometimes. Like, it's way easier to just walk into a store and buy a piece of clothing that, like, in the end does the job also. So
Yep. Yeah, it is funny. It's because I think some people don't realize how poor quality stuff in the store is. I'm not willing to spend a lot of money on clothes usually. And so then I'm looking at the really cheap stuff, but then you're feeling this clothing and it's like this fabric is pretty much see-through. And it, like, the seams are barely there, and like it looks like it's going to disintegrate the 3rd time I wash it.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, but now you're only charging $15, $20 for it. So I guess that's worth it. But then it's like, no, it's not, because it's still going to fall apart. And it's like, if you can figure out how to make something that you're going to love yourself, even if you use like a thrifted fabric or cheap fabric or something, and so the price is kind of comparable, you'll probably like it better because you made it yourself. But I do think most people don't calculate in the time. It can be a lot of like, oh, well, the supplies cost less than this thing in the store, and so that's all that matters. And I'm like, yeah, but you should really also take into account how long is it going to take you to gain the skills to make something you like, which is again why I like making really simple garments, because I'm like, it didn't take me long to gain those skills. Before I started sewing, I liked comfy knit dresses, and turns out they were like the easiest thing to learn how to sew, so that's worth it for me. Whereas if I was somebody who liked like tailored business suits, it would have taken a lot longer, or possibly I never would have done it. It would have been a lot more work to make it worth it to make one of those at home rather than to go buy one.
Yeah, which is probably also why this person sent in the hot take that was, just because I sew, I can't sew gifts for all my friends. They have no idea the energy it takes. And I'm like, yeah, honestly, I have actually pretty strong feelings on this. I'm like, do not feel obligated to make presents for everyone. Not to be harsh, but like not everyone deserves a handmade gift. If they're not like specifically looking for that item, they don't want it, or they don't understand the amount of work that goes into it, I feel like it can actually lead to a source of like tension and stress or disappointment if you like put all this work into a gift and then you give it and maybe they didn't want it, maybe they don't know how much work you put into it, and then it's like you feel really bad because you put so much time into it, but like they didn't want it, so it's not their fault either. It's like, it's such a thing. I feel like some people really put this weight on their shoulders, especially around like winter holiday season. They put this weight of like, I've got to make something for everyone because everyone knows I knit. And I'm like, no, you really don't. Like, take that weight off your shoulders. Think carefully before you make presents for somebody.
I think it's so important to like keep in mind that you want to make stuff that you love. Like, you have a good point that if you're making what you love to make, not everybody is going to want that. Like, your style is not everybody's style. And so then, like, why bother spending all of the time on something and giving it to somebody if it's not something they'll actually love? And on the flip side, I experience this a lot with embroidery because luckily, like, nobody that I know has asked me to sew for them. And that's great. Let's keep it that way. But with embroidery, I spent years with people being like, oh, can you embroider this specific thing for me? And it was like a specific design. And I'd always be like, yeah, sure, of course. But then, like, as I was working on the piece, I would just immediately lose interest because it wasn't, like, my style of embroidery. Yes. It wasn't something that I actually liked making. And so I would just be miserable while making these pieces. And it was very much like a sense of duty that, like, oh, well, I've told somebody I'd embroider for them. And it lost all sense of joy for me. And so every single time I'd be in the middle of it and I'd be like, Matt, don't ever let me say yes to embroidering for somebody else again. And it took me years to actually commit to that. But I think that same thing can happen with sewing. If you like making something with your style, and somebody says, hey, can you make me this other thing that's my style? If you're not going to enjoy the making process of that, if it's going to be a miserable experience for you, say no. Don't force yourself to make what other people want you to make just because you have a skill that they haven't learned themselves.
There's a whole like bunch of hot takes that had to do with like homemade garments. It's fine if your homemade garments don't look professional. It's fine if your whole wardrobe is handmade. Handmade isn't bad, which totally, I totally agree with that. And while it's not like a stigma that I can say that I've ever run into in my own life, I do definitely get the impression just from like reading, feeling out, you know, the mood in the comment section that some people have like hit up against this notion that handmade is inferior to buying in a store, which, as we've literally just talked about, like that is actually not always the case. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's coming back around to being a slightly more in fashion to make things yourself.
I like want to believe that that's not a hot take anymore.
Yeah.
And I know it still is in some places, but like I want to believe that we're past that now and that nobody is saying homemade is worse and that we're all over that. And I know it's not true, but I'm like, that needs to stop being a hot take because we just need to move past that. And I agree with you. I think we are. It's just slow.
Well, I just had an epiphany when you were saying that. I'm wondering if how much of this, at least I think maybe initially when this idea started to be floated that handmade is inferior to store-bought, it did probably literally come from the fact that like, oh, you're so poor, you can't support the economy, you can't like contribute and go out and buy things because that's what's cool, and it's no longer make do and mend. We're out of the war, baby. We're like moving to the suburbs and spending all the money. But I feel like now when I hear like more modernly people talk about handmade things with a negative connotation, I wonder if it actually means the clothes that you're wearing are so unique that there's no way you could have bought them at a store because they are expressing your personality in a way that is so clearly not off the shelf. Like I'm thinking of like some of the more like I feel like people would say like eclectic or eccentric outfits. But like I feel like when people say it, it's literally just like, oh, my clothes are finally reflecting my personality and how I want to dress. And that doesn't fit this tiny narrow definition that can be bought off the rack and like to fit in with everybody else. Handmade means like you stand out, which
Yeah.
some people can get bullied for, but also, like, I think it's cool to stand out. Like, I think it's actually kind of neat that, like, you don't look like everyone else. So I wonder if that's maybe also more what people mean when they say handmade. Like, because I feel like the average layperson doesn't mean, oh, I can see that your seams don't line up. Oh, you're not pattern matching, because I feel like the average person is completely oblivious to that.
That's an excellent point. And also because a lot of store-bought clothing, I mean, again, everything is handmade. It's being handmade by people who are underpaid and overworked and exhausted. So, like, a lot of store-bought clothing also has no pattern matching and pretty shoddy seams and everything. And that's an excellent point, because I think, yeah, there's this idea of, like, ew, your clothes are handmade. And I think from the sewist side of that, we think it's like, oh, you saw that, like, this should have really been, like, tacked down better, or my seam is a little crooked here. Like, you're seeing these little mistakes that I made. But the reality is, like, no, you can't see that. Just when I film and photograph my final products and the camera is 5 feet away from me, you already can't see anything that's wrong with it. I have to specifically be like, let me show off this thing that I messed up so that you guys know that this is not a good garment. But I think it is that. It's like, we can tell that's handmade because I know that stores aren't selling that. And that was the most recent thing I had. I was wearing my, like, orchid tropical hoodie dress somewhere, and someone was like, oh, this is one of your handmade pieces, right? Not in a negative way whatsoever, but it was funny because it kind of triggered that thing in my brain from, like, back when I was a kid, where I immediately was like, I was simultaneously proud of it and ashamed of it at the same time. I was like, yes, it is, and, like, but a little part of me inside was melting at the same time. But it 100% was not that they were like, oh, this is poorly constructed or anything. It was, when have you ever seen anything that looks like that in a store? So, like, obviously this had to be one of your handmade pieces. No one is selling anything like this, except when they are, because they've started copying. All right, so then my next hot take is on the subject of thrifted fabrics, which I know we are both big fans of. And I just loved, honestly, it's like very low spicy, because I feel like everyone is on board with this, and I certainly hope everyone is on board with this. But it was just things like, most things can be made out of curtains. Bed sheets and tablecloths make fine clothes. This is another one that I'm like, I hope this isn't a hot take. I hope everyone agrees with this, because if you genuinely think that you have to go out and buy, like, the most expensive fabric, why? Why do you think that? Yeah. It's funny because I use a lot less bed sheets and curtains and stuff now, but it is legitimately only because I am so lucky to live by remainders and be able to get this thrifted, actual bolted fabric. And I'm like, if I had never found remainders, I would still be straight up sheets and everything. And I know most people don't have one of those near them. So it's like, yeah, sheets, curtains, tablecloths.
Yeah, the only, like, little, like, red flag that, like, pings off in my brain when I hear that is that when I personally think of old curtains, and maybe it's because they put the adjective old in front of it, but I'm thinking of, like, those heavy, like, draperies, you know, like tapestry and heavy fabric that, like, when you cut it, it sheds fur everywhere, and texturally it might be, like, a nightmare for your sensories, and can also be really, really hard to sew with. So, like, if you're a beginning sewist, it could actually be incredibly frustrating to try to get your machine to, like, wrangle all these thick layers. Like, as soon as you've got a couple of them joined together, it can get quite thick, and, like, if your machine can't handle that, it could be a nightmare. That's the only way that I think of it as being negative, is that it could actually be discouraging to some people. And I think it's mostly if you're new. If you're new and you don't really know necessarily what to look for in a fabric, and then that also means you probably don't know necessarily some of the tricks to, like, work with it or to make those seams thinner. But if you do, I think that you can make amazing things out of curtains, for sure. It's just, like, comes with this little, like, asterisk.
Yeah, I definitely think sheets are, like, a safer option, especially at the beginning. There's a lot more you can make with them without many, like, problems to run into. So I will say that, like, don't just run into thrifted fabric and buy it all because it's cheap. You can still be a little picky. Like, feel it first. Make sure that it's a fiber that you like, a texture that you like, a color that you like. Don't just go nuts because it's cheap stuff.
And also, conversely, just because it's cheap doesn't always mean that it is a nasty texture or whatever. Like, if we want to pull out my visual aid that I've got over here, we've got It still happens to actually have the tag on them. Got this curtain for $7.99. And it's from IKEA. And it's a linen cotton blend. And it's got like this absolutely gorgeous pattern. But they're exactly this. They're just curtains. They still have the, the hook things on here. Some of my viewers told me that I should like embroider select portions of the pattern to like add little pops of color. Like you got a little birdie, you could like embroider the birdie.
Oh my god.
Yeah, it would be so fun. I'm super excited for it. But I got it because because it is a linen cotton blend, and I like was looking specifically to make some things for summer, because I'm like, in winter my body doesn't regulate its temperature at all, so in winter give me all the polyester. I need all the help trapping the heat that I can get, but in the summer equally I don't like sweat enough, I don't regulate at all, so I'm like, I need the like lighter fabrics that breathe. And so I saw that and I was like, ooh, a linen cotton curtain, yes please, sign me up for that. I'll be making something for summer.
Also, that it's absolutely gorgeous fabric. Like,
Yeah,
that is
right?
stunning. And oh my god, you have to embroider on it. The embroidery on it is going to be gorgeous. But that makes me think, it's funny. I'm like, maybe that's why I don't care about polyester, because I am just literally cold all year round, even in the summer. My feet are still blocks of ice, and people will comment sometimes and be like, aren't you like hot in that polyester thing you made? And I'm like, no, pretty much almost never.
But actually, if we want to take an actual hot take, I have an actual hot take on the thrifted fabric. Well, kind of thrifted fabric. And it was somebody wrote in that said, a lot of YouTubers must have insane budgets to be making all of those silk and linen dresses. Which I'm like, oh, some shade is being slung there. I'm going to give that a full 5 peppers on the spiciness chart, because somebody's throwing some shade. But honestly, like, as somebody who has a tiny budget and buys pretty much only thrifted fabric, like, I mean, I see where the comment is coming from. There are some channels out there, especially because I'm more in like the historical cosplay realm. There are definitely like some people have budgets for one project that's as big as like my entire year or multiple years budgets, and it does blow my mind sometimes. Let's just say that.
But I will say what's fascinating is, like, I think when people make content about what they're making, you can get kind of negative opinions about this kind of thing. Like, oh, you spent too much money on that. But like, some people do just have bigger budgets. Like, good for them. They work hard, or they have money, whatever it is. And like, it's not an uncommon thing to invest a lot of money into something that's a hobby or an art for you. And I think it's when you share those projects, it's often shared because we're still trying to get this disconnect between I'm making a thing to tell you how to make the thing, and this is a tutorial, and I'm making the thing to entertain you, and you're just watching for entertainment. And we're still like really trying in the makerspace to pull away from that. So I think a lot of times it can be communicated or just perceived as like, I'm showing you how you could make this thing too. And then when it has that high budget, people watching are like, well, this is not relatable. I couldn't afford to make this thing too. But it's like, ultimately, it's not a bad thing that they were able to afford that. And it's not a bad thing that they were decided that that's what they want to spend their money on. Can't speak for everyone, but like, they're not necessarily saying you should be able to afford this too, and you should be willing to spend money on this too. So I do think that there can be this perception when you watch somebody's content that like, whatever you do, I should be able to do. And there are content creators who are pushing that and who are saying like, I mean, I want what I make to be an inspiration to people. And so I like that what I make is usually thrifted fabric and really simple and just winging it, and it's cheap, but that's not necessarily everybody's aim. So it's like, if you're like a costume maker, then making a costume is really a thing, like these big historical builds that take all this time. And I can kind of understand pouring more money into that. I don't think it's something I would personally want to do, but like, that doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because like, it is obviously a pull that I feel like we can both relate with as content creators as well. Like, it's something that I think about a ton in terms of accessibility, because I would love to make sewing more accessible to more people, and a discourse that, again, I'm like aware of, not like actively, but just passively, like reading people's comments on my videos or like their conversations amongst themselves or on other people's YouTube channels, sometimes in like Facebook comments or on Reddit. There is definitely a feeling, and how much of it is active on the part of creators and how much of it, again, is just being perceived by the part of the viewers. That's like a thing. But there is definitely this like discourse and this feeling that like, oh, all these people online, these influencers, these people we see, they have all these sewing tools. They have this giant sewing studio. They've got the lights and they've got all these tools and they've got all these nice fabric. Or if you look on like all the big yarn channels, they've got walls and walls of like their yarn like laid out beautifully behind them because it's their job and that's like they're making money off of it. So it's in their interest to have a beautiful backdrop. Like, I'm guilty of the same thing. You just put a bunch of money into your sewing studio. Like, it is literally for us our jobs, but it can be perceived, especially if you're not like explicit about it as the content creator, it can be like perceived as like, oh, I can't make nice things if I don't have this. All I have is a tiny table that also serves as my kitchen table. I have a pair of scissors. I don't have a rotary tool and a pinking shears and a cutting mat. And like, I don't have all the fancy tools that everyone. It's like this constant struggle because I like do understand the content creator side of it in terms of like sometimes you just got to get a video out and you're like, yes, I could do this without the fancy tools, but it would literally take me twice as long. And because this isn't a hobby, it's a job. I have a deadline to meet. I kind of need to use the fancy tools. I remember very clearly, I was like hit by this wave of guilt. I think, what was I doing? I think I was doing my 24-hour pirate shirt, maybe. I was doing one of the makes and I got out my rotary tool and I was just about to roll. I like set up the camera and everything. And then I was like, wait, I had this like wave of guilt because I used a scissors and a rotary tool in the same video. And I was like, oh, but what if that like gives the wrong impression? And I was like panicking, but I was also on a deadline. Like literally, I think it was my 24-hour pirate shirt. So I was like on a deadline and I was like, I need to cut this out. And I was like, do I cut it out on camera with a pair of scissors and then switch and do the rotary cutter off camera? And I have literally done that a couple of times just because I want it to feel accessible. But then I'm like, but now I feel like I'm kind of lying also. It's like just this super weird struggle because I'm like, I want people to feel like literally all you need. This basically like goes into my next point of my next hot take.
I was going to say, we're
going right into the next take, which is you don't need all the fancy tools shops try to sell you. Sharp scissors for the win. And I like totally absolutely agree. Like bare bones, all you need is like either a needle and thread or a sewing machine and a pair of good scissors.
Yeah, I mean, people have asked me, like, oh, are you going to upgrade your sewing machine at any point? Because, like, the Singer Fashion Made is like, oh, cutesy, I'm, like, going to start sewing kind of sewing machine. And I'm like, it sews the stitches that I need, and it hasn't given me any problems. So, like, no, I'm not going to upgrade. But I've also thought about this in terms of getting a serger. You know, I was about to just, like, go out and get one, because why not kind of thing. And then a lot of people commented and were like, oh, but, like, you not having a serger makes me feel like I can make the things that you make because I don't have a serger either. And I was like, oh, well, it'd be nice to have a serger, but also like I'm getting along fine without it. So I guess I won't prioritize getting it, but I'm still going to get one at some point. And I'm kind of thinking like, oh, at that point, like if I start sewing a knit dress and just zipping it through a serger instead of sewing it on a sewing machine, does that suddenly make this disconnect of like, oh, well, I thought I could make the things that you make, but now I'm seeing that I don't have the same tools as you, and so now I can't. So it is finding that balance where it's like, not even just because I'm a content creator or because I've started making a living wage off of this, also just the longer you sew, the more tools you are naturally going to acquire.
Yeah.
And like, it would be weird if you didn't do that. Like, it would be kind of weird if you'd been sewing for 10 years and you were like, I've never bought another tool. So like, it makes sense that you're going to do that. But yeah, then at the same time, if you are someone who's trying to make sewing seem more accessible, or it is accessible, so just if you're trying to highlight that in your videos, then it is very much like, oh, well, where do I draw the line? And I think it would be nice, like, yeah, I'll probably get a serger at some point, but then maybe I still won't use it in every video. And it sounds really cheesy to be like, oh, I'm trying to be relatable. It's not necessarily that I'm like, oh, I have to be relatable. It's that I really want people to get out of my videos that they can also sew, that they can do it too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a really good point that you made about like collecting things over time, because like I've been sewing, like I started sewing to make leotards for myself when I was like 10. I've been sewing for a long time, you know, and obviously I wasn't like sewing avidly / I was using my parents' stuff, you know, for the first couple decades of all that. And I love thrifting. So like the thing is, like everything you see here with the exception of the grommet press, which I also pretty much refuse to use in videos because I only have ever used it a couple times. I've set literally, and I'm not even kidding you, hundreds and hundreds of grommets by hand with the little cheap hand kits, like actual in the thousands easily. So I don't use it. But everything else is thrifted. It's like, it's just thrifted, but there's no, like, what am I gonna do? Announce that at the beginning of every video? Everything here that you saw was thrifted over the course of the last decade and a half, with the exception of my 2 sewing machines and my sharp scissors. Like, who does that, you know? So it's like kind of the struggle between like feeling responsibility as somebody with like an online platform versus like the natural tendency of people to collect things / get gifted things, like not even by family members. I mean, like, oh, you sew, like, here for Christmas I'm giving you this, like, you know, like eventually it's just like, whether you want it or not, you might start getting quite a big collection of sewing things or all kinds of making things, you know?
So I realized that we only made it through a few of your hot takes at this point in the video. Turns out that Charlie and I actually had a ton to say, but the problem is that this video is really, really long, and I'm afraid that if I made it any longer, my current Wi-Fi situation would not be able to handle the upload. So I have split it into 2 videos. Keep your eyes peeled for the second half of our current discussion on your sewing hot takes on this channel in the coming weeks, and then be sure to keep your eyes out over on Charlie's channel for part 2, or at this point, would it actually be part 3? I don't even know, of our discussion. All the rest of your sewing hot takes, a little bit more snark, lots more fun. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had fun. Hope you got some work done on the project, whatever it is you were working on, and I'll catch you in next week's video.
I remember the first time Phil voluntold me to sew something, and I was like, okay, but you need to talk to me before you volunteer me to do that. Okay, like, yeah, it's his mom. In general, I don't mind, and it doesn't come up a lot, but as a policy, please, can you run that by me before you volunteer me for things?